Well, quite interestingly, Sudan was recently placed by the United States on its list of states that are not doing enough to combat human trafficking, a decision the country says it regrets. That's according to the foreign minister. But even with that at play, Sudan is very optimistic that the U.S. will fully lift those sanctions against the country. The spokesperson for the Sudanese parliament says the government has gotten many positive signs from American officials.
We expect that the U.S. sanctions will be lifted. All the signs indicate that this will happen. I am very optimistic and I believe that the probabilities are above 90%. Again, all the indications are leading to this result.
For Sudan, it has been a long journey since the sanctions were imposed in 1997. The US then accused Sudan of supporting Islamist groups. The founder of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, had lived in Khartoum for 4 years between 1992 and 1996. And then there was the deadly conflict in Darfur in which hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed. Over the years, successive U.S. administrations have accused Khartoum of human rights violations in that conflict, and Sudan's President Omar al-Bashir has since been indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes and crimes against humanity. But last week in Khartoum, President Bashir was outlining the efforts his country has made to rebuild relations with Washington.
This initiative of the national dialogue and then getting all the political parts with all seriousness and effectiveness and efficiency has drawn a real. This has led that the security situation of Sudan has been extended throughout the country, especially in Darfur states, where the efforts of enhancing peace in this region has sort of the gradual withdrawal of UNAMID forces.
The U.S. has recently sought to strengthen Sudan's ability to address profound security challenges in a difficult region in which many of its neighbors are deeply unstable. It's no coincidence that Khartoum is positioning itself as a peacemaker in the region.
And I would like here to affirm through this conference that we will spare no efforts in giving all the assistance support for our refugees from our neighbor country, South Sudan.
Those efforts, it seems, may have finally convinced Washington to bring Khartoum back into the fold. Penina Karibe, CGTN.
Well, for more insights on this story, we're joined by Giles Gibson. He's live for us in Washington, D.C. We'll also be speaking to Dr. Adam Zolo here in our Nairobi studio. But let's start, of course, in D.C. Giles, we've, of course, been seeing some strong indications that the sanctions imposed on Sudan by the U.S. are going to be lifted. What more can you tell us about this?
That's right. We're seeing really mounting reports here in the US media and in international media as well that the Trump administration are expected to make some sort of an announcement on these expected lifting of these sanctions imminent really. So we're expecting that announcement any minute now really from the US State Department. This of course follows the Trump administration's decision back in July to postpone making a decision on whether they would permanently lift these sanctions, and now the expectation is that they will be lifting them as soon as we hear from the State Department and the White House. Now the only sort of other part of that is that while these sanctions are expected to be lifted, the listing of Sudan as a country that's a state sponsor of terror at this stage, that's not expected to be lifted alongside the lifting of those sanctions.
And of course, we know that the Sudanese are very excited about this decision, also feeling very optimistic. Overall, what's prompted the U.S. to reconsider the embargoes they placed on Sudan almost 20 years ago?
Well, the Reuters news agency, they quoted an anonymous US official explaining why this expected lifting of these sanctions is actually expected to go ahead. He was quoted as saying, or she was quoted as saying, that there's been progress on human rights inside Sudan and also progress on counter-terrorism. But really the other side of this story, and something that's also expected, that we also understand is perhaps driving this decision to lift these sanctions, is that Sudan has quite recently really distanced itself and made a very public effort to distance itself from North Korea. The Sudanese foreign minister Ibrahim Gandor, was quoted as saying just this week that the US administration is quite convinced that we don't have any relations with North Korea whatsoever. So certainly that progress on human rights and progress on counter-terrorism reportedly being recognized by the US government, but also that progress on North Korea, which is obviously a key issue for the United States in terms of foreign policy at the moment, could be driving this expected announcement as well.
And if indeed those sanctions are lifted, how might this drive the future of US and Sudan's relations?
Well, really, the expectation is that we'll see much closer partnership between the US government and the Sudanese government in terms of counter-terrorism issues, in terms of security in that region of Africa. What we have seen already is Sudan dropped from the list of travel restrictions, a list of countries that had travel restrictions placed on them earlier in the year. We've also seen a lot of cooperation, a lot of closer cooperation between the two countries' intelligence agencies, but really one potential road bump in these ever closer relations between the two countries is of course that ruling by a US court earlier this year. They ruled that the Sudanese government should pay $2.1 billion to the families of Americans who were victims in those 1998 embassy bombings. So while the two countries are certainly moving much closer together in terms of cooperating on issues like security and counter-terrorism, that's one potential issue that could sort of hold back the relationship if the Sudanese government continues to say that they're not going to pay up that $2.1 billion court decision.
All right, well, Giles Gibson, thanks very much. Following developments there in Washington, D.C. And as he says, that decision is imminent. For now, though, let's bring in Dr. Adams Olo into the discussion, international relations expert from University of Nairobi. Thanks, as always, for joining us, Dr. Olo. Of course, we've seen Sudan. We know that, of course, Sudan at the moment is expecting that these sanctions will be lifted. And of course, it has been almost 20 years with these sanctions. What impact have they had, particularly on their isolation, as far as the international community is concerned?
Well, I think the isolation has made it that Sudan has been seen as a pariah kind of state. And one has to take into account that the president of Sudan, al-Bashir, has also been indicted by the ICC. So when you combine those two, you must say that it has made relationships between Sudan and other countries a little bit tense, a little bit not friendly.
And do you think the United States was justified in maintaining these sanctions for so long?
Well, basically, as a superpower, always a country wants to show direction and also show that it can punish as well as reward. And I think that among the accusations that the U.S. had against Sudan was, for example, harboring terrorists. It also was accused of abusing human rights, and therefore it was using Sudan as an example to other countries that might go rogue.
And of course, all signs pointing to the fact now that the sanctions will indeed be lifted. How will this affect the socio-economic and political development of Sudan?
I think to a very great extent, Sudan will benefit from this, to the extent that there has been kind of countries not being free to trade with it, for example. Also, you'll find that there have been countries which are allies to the U.S., but which have a problem with some Islamic countries, for example, Saudi Arabia and Israel in the Middle East, are against Iran, but would rather trade with Sudan. So I think that from an economic point of view and also from a Middle East perspective, I think that Sudan will be the winner in all this. I know that the U.S. might be seen as having not kept up to its standards, because there are human rights activists who are saying that not all has gone well to make Sudan be let go, but I think at some point it had to be let go.
And you did, of course, mention that the ICC has an arrest warrant against the president of Sudan. Do you think this will change at all in light of these sanctions potentially being lifted?
I don't think it will change at all, because the U.S. is not even a member state of the countries that have signed the accord on ICC. And basically that will be treated separately from that. So I don't see that happening.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Adams Olo, here in studio with us, of course, on those sanctions to be lifted.